the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, a gift that a king did bring. He came twice in 1353 to Lent war dine, and there came a king.
Laying a cloth of gold, see it there unfold, masses for the high-born son, for their souls, yes, this was done.
And thank you for inviting me to come and speak to you today. I must admit, when I started thinking about this talk and what I was going to say, I was excited, but also quite intimidated in equal measure. I was excited partly because I've heard a lot of really great things about the Mortimer History Society from Paul Driver, but also because preparing this talk would give me the opportunity to delve into something that I don't always get to think about, and that's this kind of aspect of early 14th century English political and courtly life. So up until recently, my research has focused mainly on court politics and courtly culture from the latter half of the 14th century, so the later part of Edward III's reign, but even more so the reign of Richard II in the 1370s to 1390s. My forthcoming book on the latest of the Garter examines the women who received Garter robes in the later Middle Ages, but as the first woman to receive her robes didn't get them until 1375, and indeed the order itself wasn't founded until 1348, I've not had much opportunity of late to really think about the early 14th century. But I've always been aware of the fact that the political circumstances of that latter part of the century were really underpinned by earlier events, from the 1320s and 1330s. So it's given me the opportunity to really explore these origins, and I'm really hoping to get some feedback and ideas from what is a very well-informed audience. As any historian of the later Middle Ages can attest, the Mortimer name appears everywhere in historical records. And this leads me to explain why I was a little bit intimidated by the prospect of discussing the topic of dynastic marriage in the Mortimer family today. It's an overwhelming task. In the later Middle Ages, the Mortimer name is everywhere. It's so prominent. And that's partly because Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March, had so many children. 12 are known to have survived to adulthood, 10 of whom made dynastically, diplomatically, politically, and, as we'll see today, territorially significant marriages. And he's really an exception to the rule in the 14th century. Not many families of this rank have so many children and have this ability to make all of these marriages. These marriages, as I'll argue today, reflect a conscious, very deliberate strategy on Mortimer's part, a strategy to consolidate his power and resources, as well as realise dynastic ambitions. And through his children's marriages, we see Mortimer rise and fall, and then rise and fall again. But despite his execution in 1330, the Mortimer family and its name endured, permeating the English nobility at all levels, and bringing the family in ever closer proximity to the crown until, over a century later, in 1461, a Mortimer descendant was crowned King Edward IV of England. So I'm going to start today this talk by offering a tiny bit of background, a few comments on medieval marriage, although hopefully not repeating too much of what Emma said earlier today, and also some background into the Mortimer family in general, most of which I'm sure is very familiar to most of you in this room. I'm then going to discuss the dynastic marriages of each of Roger Mortimer's 10 married children roughly in turn, although some of them overlap and it's not entirely clear when some of these marriages actually took place. But the marriages fall into two broad chronological categories. So those made prior to Roger Mortimer's arrest and exile. Most of these were kind of contracted before 1321, so that's kind of the first batch. And then there were those that were arranged during his sort of ascendancy, sort of 1328 to 1330. But as we shall see, similar concerns informed and impacted Mortimer's selection of spouse for each of his children. The consolidation of territories and titles was obviously forefront, but also political concerns, national, but also most crucially on the local, regional level. There was also a concern about social status as well, and this becomes something that shifts as we see Roger Mortimer's own position change. I'm going to place the marriages of Mortimer's children in a wider context, so starting with a long-standing Mortimer marriage policy which predated the first Earl of March, but also think in the context of the long-term impact of some of these dynastic marriages. I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts about how the Mortimer legacy played out for some of his descendants. And I hope you'll indulge me while I talk about some of my sort of later research. While writing this talk, I came to some interesting realizations about certain aspects of my own research into the later 14th century. So these are individuals whose lives intersected with the Mortimers throughout the 14th century. And thinking about this early part of the 14th century, place some of the courtly occurrences of the 1380s and 1390s that I'm so familiar with into really stark focus. So I'm hoping you'll indulge me a little later while I talk about the Order of the Garter, and a little bit about Princess Joan, who I mentioned in the questions for Emma's talk earlier, the Fair Maiden of Kent, the mother of Richard II, who, as I mentioned before, was one of the few high-status women to self-marry, as Emma said, and petition for an annulment. So she's quite an interesting person for thinking about medieval marriage, but has some interesting connections to the Mortimer family as well. So, as Emma explored in her talk on aristocratic marriage this morning, medieval marriage involved extensive arrangements, especially with regards to property. Medieval inheritance presented a problem. It was very rare for landed property to pass intact from one individual to another. Lands were generally used to support entire family groups, through some of the examples that Emma explored today. So the assignment of dower lands to widows, dowries to daughters, but also designations of lands to younger sons. So this could compromise and devalue a family's wealth and the patrimony. But enterprising families, such as the Mortimers, could employ strategies for consolidation for consolidation and further accumulation of lands. Historian Scott Waugh has identified three primary strategies that medieval families used for doing this. The first was patronage, so specifically royal patronage, so acquiring additional property through a royal gift, maybe as a reward for service. And these gifts could be both permanent but also temporary. I think Emma mentioned wardships earlier today. These are kind of moments in time where an aristocrat would have temporary control of a portion of land or property. The second strategy was straightforward purchase and acquisition. So if resources were available, particularly cash, a landowner could purchase property from neighbours or even their own relatives, so cousins who have somehow come into possession of part of the patrimony, to consolidate a territorial block. And this is something that Roger Mortimer did quite a lot. But by far the most important strategy was marriage. Marriage allowed wealth to circulate through inheritance, and grants to families that were connected and to formulate connections, and we see this in the Mortimer family. These marriages wove individuals through the landholding elite of England, as well as the wider British Isles, Ireland, Wales, and even the continent into a network of affinity and family. If used well, strategic marriage could contain and counterbalance that devaluation of family wealth that I mentioned before, accounting for the loss of aspects of inheritance through assignment of dower lands, for example. But strategic marriage also provided an opportunity for a family to acquire additional lands, which could then be endowed on younger children without disturbing patrimony. As Jennifer Ward has argued, the rise of specific noble families in the Middle Ages could be the result of royal service and favour, but it was predominantly the result of advantageous marriages. My undergraduate supervisor, Sandy Grant, used to say your goal as a man was to marry a big, fat, juicy heiress, and the Mortimer families did this very well. And the Mortimer family were very good at making advantageous marriages, going back generations before the Earl of March. And this particular family is so interesting. It illustrates how matchmaking could consolidate a patrimony with powerful networks of blood, lordship, and affinity. So I'm going to turn my attention now to Roger Mortimer, first Earl of March. I'm sure many of you are familiar with his biography, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. He was born in 1287, was the son and heir of Edmund de Mortimer and his wife, Margaret Mortimer. His father died while Roger was still underage in 1304, so he was still technically a minor, and his wardship was granted to Prince Edward's notorious favourite, Piers Gaveston, giving him control over the inheritance, as well as technically the right to arrange the marriage of the underage heir. 2 years later, at the age of 19, so we would probably consider them an adult today, but still considered underage, Mortimer paid 2,500 marks to recover his lands, end his minority, and give him the right to marry his own choice of partner. However, Mortimer had already started quite a way down his marital path at this point. He had been betrothed to and likely married to his wife, Joan de Geneville, since September 1301, and probably married shortly thereafter. And they were likely to have had at least 2 children by 1306. Now, Roger's wife Joan was an excellent choice. She was the daughter of Peter de Geneville, who had died about a decade earlier, and his French wife, Jeanne de Lusignan, who was the daughter of Hugh de Lusignan, Count of La Marche and Angoulême. As we'll see, Joan's French mother's inheritance would have a sort of positive ramification for one of their younger sons after Jeanne's death in 1323. But in the immediate term, Mortimer's marriage to Joan brought the vast Geneville estates under his control, bringing him a share in the lordship of Butler, as well as vast estates in Ireland and the rest of the March of Wales. As a result of his own extensive family lands combined with those of his wife's family, Mortimer became one of the premier English landowners in Ireland, South Wales, and the west of England. The acquisition, preservation, and cultivation of property absorbed the energies of families at all social levels in medieval England. Such acquisitions allowed families to consolidate lands for older sons, so develop the patrimony, but also provide for younger sons, daughters, and widows. Marriage also fostered group cohesion, as we shall see, uniting families through political and social networks as well as kinship. Although marriage was theoretically exogamous, so women married out of their natal family and into their husbands, it didn't sever all ties. Canny landowners such as Roger Mortimer and his kin arranged the marriages of their daughters to protect and further acquire lands, taking regional considerations into mind. So they were thinking about the consolidation of lands, but also political concerns as well. As Paul Driver has commented, the fruitfulness of Mortimer's marriage, as you can see here, allowed him the ability to engage in a series of alliances with families of similar standing, entrenching his family's position in England and the aristocratic nexus spanning the British Isles. These marriages, which I shall turn to shortly, brought Mortimer in close proximity and ultimately, the Mortimer family rather, in close proximity to and ultimately possession of the crown. But Roger Mortimer, the first Earl of March, was not the first member of the Mortimer family to employ such techniques. I don't know why this isn't working now. There we go. Sorry, that's come out very pixelated, I'm afraid. As Scott Waugh has shown, and this image is from his book, and it's not turned out brilliantly on the slide, I'm afraid, at least 3 generations of Mortimers prior to Roger Mortimer arranging the marriages of his own children, the Mortimer men and women drew wives and husbands from a pool of cousins descended from or allied by marriage to the Marshall family. So unfortunately you can't see it, but at the very top you can see William Marshall, who was the first Earl of Pembroke. So, for instance, Ralph the Marshal, who died in 1246, married his 2 sons, Hugh and Roger, who died in 1282, to Marshal descendants, giving them a stake in the Marshal patrimony. As I've already mentioned, a generation later, Roger Mortimer was married to Joan de Geneville, who was the great-granddaughter of Walter de Lacy and a descendant of the Marshalls as well. And this marriage gave Mortimer half of the lordship of Ludlow, which replaced Wigmore as the centre of the Mortimer Empire. These marriages laid the groundwork for the eventual reunification of lordship through purchases from cousins. And as we'll see, this concern with marrying descendants of the Marshall family played into Roger's selection of spouses for his own children as well, particularly his heir Edmund. As Jennifer Ward wrote, the nobility saw marriage in the context of family and inheritance. More commonly, marriages were made with local considerations in mind, especially in border regions such as the March of Wales. The Mortimer family had for generations used marriage to acquire land and strengthen relations with local families in the Welsh Marches and the west of England. And in the 1310s and 1320s, Roger Mortimer continued and expanded his family's long-standing tradition. While Mortimer's career demonstrates how far an individual can go, he was building on a family tradition, and that's, I think, a really important takeaway for this, and I think his descendants learned from this as well. Although Mortimer saw a peak in his power and influence during his adulterous relationship with Queen Isabella, at a time when one might expect a man to perhaps neglect the needs of his family, Mortimer was in fact very careful to ensure that his family continued to benefit from his rise to power. So for now, I want to consider the choices that he made for his children early in his career, so prior to his imprisonment and subsequent exile in 1323. In some cases, such as that of his oldest son and heir, Edmund Mortimer, I want to return to these marriages later and think about the family line and the dynastic and political consequences for the marriage that Roger actually chose. So, as I've already mentioned before, Roger and his wife were betrothed in September 1301, prior to the death of Roger Mortimer's father Edmund, and they were likely married long before Roger paid Gaveston 2,500 marks to recover his lands and end his minority in 1306. Both Roger and Joan appear to have been of age, of consent, so 14 for boys, 12 for girls, when they were betrothed and married. Although, as we'll see, betrothal and marriage could take place before the age of consent. Betrothal could take place legally from the age of 7, which was considered the age of reason, but many noble and royal marriages where large inheritances and titles were concerned, this worry about age was kind of thrown out the window. That's not to say that they were kind of child marriages where grown men would be sleeping with underage girls. Children were just as sacred, and I think Emma mentioned previously about the kind of stipulations that would be put in place in case either party tried to reject their spouse when they came of age. So consent was important. But Roger and Joan were both of consensual age when they married, and they didn't waste any time getting on with the business of producing heirs. Over the course of about 18 years, Joan would bear Roger at least 12 children. There are 12 that survived to adulthood, meaning that she spent the majority of the years 1302 to 1319 pregnant, which, having spent the last few months of my life in that condition, I honestly can't imagine anything worse. She must have been exhausted, for one thing. Perhaps that might be why she didn't mind her husband taking off with the Queen. It probably gave her a bit of a break. So I'm going to turn to the first and probably the most important marriage that Roger arranged, and that was for his eldest son and heir, Edmund. Now, it's not entirely clear to me whether Roger and Joan's first child was actually their son Edmund or their daughter Margaret. There's probably somebody in this room who can correct me. There seems to be some consensus among historians that Edmund arrived first, and probably around 1302, 1303. Certainly, when he married Elizabeth in May 1316, that would have placed him around the age of 14. But as we'll see, the concern for the age of his bride wasn't really a problem here. So in May 1316, Edmund was contracted to marry Elizabeth, the daughter of Bartholomew Badlesmere. And why did Roger choose this particular bride for his son and heir? Her father was a Kentish landowner, so on the slide here you can see Leeds Castle in Kent. He had some minor interests in Shropshire and Herefordshire, close to the Mortimer seat of power, but really when we think about land holdings, especially in comparison to some of the later marriages that Roger made for his children, this one seems to be a bit of an outlier. Given the importance of this particular marriage, this was the marriage of his son and heir, it seems very unlikely to me that he would have chosen this bride without very careful consideration. So why did he go for the daughter of Badlesmere? Well, as Paul Dryber has shown, a specific territorial advantage doesn't appear to have been there. Neither does an overt sort of political advantage or on either a local or national level. It's true that Badlesmere became the steward of the royal household, but that was after the marriage, that was from 1318. But as Dryber has shown, the wedding guests invited to the nuptials, which took place at Ernwood in Shropshire, offer some indication for the political leanings of both men at the time. So at around this time in his career, Roger was kind of regarded as politically neutral. He wasn't really the rebel that he became. The guests were, for the most part, politically moderate courtiers, loyal to the king, opposed to his manipulative favourites, the Despensers and so on. So these men were people who towed the middle line. They were not outwardly opposing the Earl of Lancaster, keen to resolve difficulties in Iran. So there's a potential kind of political motivation. This marriage might help Roger to gain recognition in a group of political moderates. It might help entrench his position at court. However, I think if we look at the Badlesmere family tree a little bit more carefully, paying close attention to the distaff branch, so I'm thinking here particularly of Elizabeth's mother, it's possible to find a very clear link to the Clare Marshall family, who I mentioned before. The Mortimers had been marrying into the Marshall family for at least 3 generations. Elizabeth Badlesmere's mother, Margaret de Clare, was the daughter of Thomas de Clare, who was the younger son of Richard de Clare, Earl of Hertford, and his father in turn was Gilbert de Clare, his mother Isabel Marshall, so the daughter of William Marshall, Earl of Pembroke, actually making her the sister of Roger Mortimer's great-grandmother, Eva Marshall. So in this context, while the territorial benefit might not have been as strong as it was in some of the later marriages, the dynastic connection's really there. In marrying his eldest son to a descendant of the Clare Marshalls, Roger Mortimer was following a very well-established, highly conventional family strategy. So this is one that his own father had employed. The Badlesmere family, the Badlesmere marriage, therefore, was about continuing a Mortimer policy as much as it was about firming up new political alliances. For Badlesmere, this was clearly a good match. He paid 2,000 marks for the marriage, and Mortimer endowed the couple with lands in Somerset and Buckingham, plus reversions of lands in the Western Shires and the March of Wales. Elizabeth was granted at least 5 Mortimer manors as part of her dower. And as I've already alluded to, it seems likely that Elizabeth was not at the age of consent for girls when she married Edmund in 1316. She probably would have been about 3, so not even of the age of reason to kind of give kind of present consent. Indeed, she didn't give birth to her first child, Roger, the future second Earl of March, until November 1328, so that kind of tallies with the age. I'd like to turn briefly now to some of the other marriages that Mortimer arranged. So the next one I'm going to talk about is the marriage with Geoffrey Mortimer. Now, again, it's not been terribly clear to me the order at which Roger's children arrived. Geoffrey was probably his second son, could be his third, could be his fourth. And he was born sometime around 1307. Despite being a younger son, Roger secured for Geoffrey a considerable inheritance. He was rewarded in turn by his son's unquestioning loyalty and support throughout the 1320s and into the 1330s. Geoffrey was in France at the time of his father's arrest in 1323. That same year, he had inherited his grandmother, Jeanne de Lusignan's French estates, and it seems likely that Roger Mortimer envisioned this particular younger son as heading up a sort of cadet branch of the Mortimer family on the continent. Choosing for him a French bride, Jeanne de Lazy, who he married sometime around 1316, maybe 1317, 1318. Geoffrey returned to England with his father in 1326, showing him unfailing loyalty throughout the height of his power. He was captured and arrested alongside his father at Nottingham Castle in October 1330, but was soon pardoned and allowed to return to France. Earlier that year, in March 1330, Geoffrey had received the forfeited lands of Edmund, Earl of Kent, half-brother of Edward II. Now, the story goes that Edmund, Earl of Kent, had been fooled into believing that his half-brother was still alive, being held at Corfe Castle, and that he then rallied around a kind of plot to put his brother back on the throne. He was duly executed by Mortimer at Winchester on the 19th of March. And historians have kind of pointed to Edmund's death, his kind of jurisdictional murder, as something of a catalyst, the thing that made Edward III, the young Edward III, decide to kind of throw off the Mortimer regime later that year. It's interesting to note, however, that while Mortimer's son Geoffrey had been one of the main kind of beneficiaries of the demise of the Earl of Kent, the Earl had in fact benefited from and played an active role in the downfall of Bartholomew Badlesmere, who I mentioned before. So, for example, when Badlesmere defected to the opposition against the king and the Despensers in 1321, the Earl of Kent was made Warden of the Cinque Ports in his place. He took part in the siege of Leeds Castle, which is on the screen up here, forcing Badlesmere to surrender, eventually leading to his death and execution. Kent also took part in the fighting against the rebels in the Welsh marches, including Mortimer, and he was one of the main beneficiaries of the Mortimer forfeiture in 1323. That same year, Kent also took a leading role in taking Wallingford Castle from Maurice Berkeley, patriarch of another family connected to the Mortimers through marriage, which I'll discuss now. But I want to keep Edmund, Earl of Kent, in mind for later. He was kind of the person that kept bothering me as I was preparing this talk, and yeah, I'll return to him in a moment. So, without a doubt, Roger's eldest daughter was Margaret Mortimer, and the Berkeley connection was one of the most important of Roger's career. The marriage between Margaret, who was born in around 1304, to Thomas Berkeley was part of the plan to construct a robust network of allegiance and honour long-term friendships. So Thomas Berkeley's father, Maurice Berkeley, became a loyal supporter of Mortimer and his cause from around 1318 onwards. This is Berkeley Castle, by the way. Maurice Berkeley's first wife had been an heiress to the Brewer's inheritance in the March of Wales, which gave the family a territorial and dynastic link to the Mortimers. And the marriage between the couple was contracted sometime around May 1319. And as the political climate of the 1310s and early 1320s shifted, the Berkeley family effectively rallied to Mortimer's cause. And in return, Mortimer assisted Maurice Berkeley's widow, Isabella, in her attempt to recover her share of the Clare inheritance. Most significantly, in April 1327, the deposed Edward II was transferred from the custody of his cousin, Henry, Earl of Lancaster, to that of Mortimer's son-in-law, Thomas Berkeley, and was taken to Berkeley Castle, where he met his grisly end. So this is a really important relationship, and we can kind of see how Mortimer was using his sons-in-law, his daughters-in-law's family to kind of meet his political ends and back one another up. But marrying off daughters in the Middle Ages was a very costly business. The bride's family were expected to pay a suitable dowry of either land or money, and in 1319, Mortimer granted Margaret a marriage portion amounting to about £1,000, so this is quite a large amount. The fact that Mortimer was able to raise such significant portions for each of his 7 married daughters is a testament to the resources he had at his disposal. And 3 of his daughters were married or contracted to be married within the same year, so he had a lot going on, and it was a very expensive time for him. The second daughter to get married in 1319 was Matilda, who was likely born again around 1307 to John de Charlton, who was the heir to Lord Powys. John Charlton Sr. had been a landholder in Shropshire, although his marriage to Haywise de la Pole brought him the lordship of Powys. Charlton had actually been amongst the guests invited to the wedding of Edmund Mortimer and Elizabeth Badlesmere in 1316, and the marriage between Matilda and John cemented a long-term friendship. It was described by Paul Driver as the logical culmination of the development of their friendship. Throughout Mortimer's imprisonment and exile in 1323 and 1326, Charlton remained overtly loyal to the king while continuing to communicate with his old friend. In 1326, he took part in the capture of the Earl of Arundel and delivered to the Earl to Mortimer and Isabella at Hereford for execution. As a result of this display of loyalty, he was shown great favour during the height of Mortimer's power. Philip did point out to me earlier today that this image is effectively upskirting the Earl of Warwick, so I apologise. We don't quite have genitalia in this one, but it's not far off. So perhaps one of the most famous Mortimer marriages, also contracted in 1319, was that of Catherine Mortimer and Thomas Beauchamp, who was the Earl of, who was the heir, rather, to the Earldom of Warwick. Now he was underage, the Earl of Warwick was underage at the time, so gaining this particular wardship and marriage was incredibly valuable to Roger. On the 20th of July 1318, he paid 16,000 marks for the marriage of the heir, and in 1329, at the age of 16, Beauchamp inherited his father's title. There is some speculation as to whether the marriage actually took place much later than 1319, but it was solidly contracted, and there were lots of restrictions either side should these two underage children repudiate the marriage and reject their spouse. So they were pretty locked in from a young age. The marriage required a papal dispensation, as both members of the marriage were descended from an earlier Roger Mortimer, the one who had died in 1214, and were descendants of William Marshal. It was a particularly important marriage because it helped settle a territorial dispute between the two families. The Beauchamp heir was also heir to the Tony inheritance, which included lordships in Wales that the Mortimer family also claimed through their Brewer's family connection. So the union kind of between Catherine and Thomas effectively merged the claims, and there's some belief that Mortimer quite cleverly assigned these disputed lands to Catherine as her marriage portion, even though arguably they weren't really his to assign. So this, the nature of descent in medieval England enhanced the importance of marriages because it allowed couples to fuse these competing claims, competing and in some cases complementary claims to property. The marriage of his daughter to the heir of an earldom also clearly indicates Mortimer's aspirations at this time. He wanted his family to achieve the highest level of the English nobility, so he was using his children as tools in a sort of game of dynastic aggrandizement, something that was taking place on a local level but also across the British Isles, in Geoffrey's case, even across the continent. And we see this sort of trans-British situation going on with the final marriage that Roger arranged before his exile, which was that of his one of his other younger sons, Roger, to Joan Butler. Now, I've already mentioned that around this time Mortimer was politically neutral, but the landscape changed significantly in the 1320s after Mortimer returned from his last trip to Ireland. By 1321, there was a rift with the king over the March of Wales, and on the 11th of February 1321, Roger and his wife Joan fiefed all of their lands in Ireland to one of their youngest sons. So this is where you kind of portion off lands and give kind of use of the lands to another, almost to a third party. So Roger was probably aged around 14 at this time, because this marriage was arranged with Joan Butler, who was the daughter and heiress to Sir Edmund Butler, who was a major Irish landholder as well. Edmund Butler paid £1,000 for the marriage in 1321. But as I've already mentioned, it's possible that Roger was younger than 14 at this time. In 1322, Roger was arrested and imprisoned, and he wasn't released from imprisonment until his father's return to England in 1326. And as a result of this, he and Joan, I don't think, spent much time together. They certainly didn't have any children. Roger was knighted alongside his two brothers just before the coronation of King Edward III, but his wife Joan Butler probably died in 1327 or 1328 before they had any children, kind of rendering this whole plan of enfeoffment void. Roger also himself died in 1328, so Mortimer Sr. had to come up with a sort of alternative plan. But you can see him sort of arranging his children, his sons, in different parts of the British Isles and the continent as kind of heading up their own dynasties, really. So I've outlined the marriages that Mortimer contracted for his children prior to his arrest and exile. For the most part, they reflect a clear strategy, a continuation of the family strategy, consolidate lands. But the political circumstances were very different when Roger Mortimer arranged the marriages of his younger children that I'll turn to now. So I'm going to run over some chronology very quickly, probably very familiar to most of you, however. So in 1322, Mortimer was captured and sent to the Tower, where he was condemned to death. This was changed to life imprisonment, but he then famously escaped to France, where he was welcomed by the French king, who, French kings typically don't like English kings. Shortly thereafter, Queen Isabella arrived, followed by her son. By 1326, Isabella and Mortimer were known to be lovers. They returned to England with a force from Hainault. They were welcomed by people who resented Edward II's favourites. And as Maurice Keene wrote, in an age when the exercise of patronage was inseparable from the conduct of government, royal favour was a potential source of friction between a king and his subjects. This was true for the reign of Edward II, incredibly true for the reign of Edward II, but as we'll see, it was also true for the regime of Isabella and Mortimer as well. So in 1326, Prince Edward was proclaimed Keeper of the Realm. Shortly afterwards, in Parliament, in January 1327, Edward II was deposed. He abdicated, I think he was probably forced, provided that his son be allowed to succeed him, and thus the 14-year-old Edward III came to the throne. Mortimer played a prominent role, ceremonially in his coronation. As I've already mentioned, his three sons, Edmund, Roger, and Geoffrey, were knighted alongside the king. This is such an important ceremony, the dubbing of a young king by his royal uncle. But it places the Mortimer boys almost on a level. They're not of the blood royal, but they're there being dubbed alongside him. It's quite a statement. Mortimer did incredibly well out of the coup of 1327. He received a full pardon. He benefited greatly from his relationship with the Queen and her son. As the Rochester Chronicle said, while the Queen ruled, Mortimer reigned. Mark Ormerod wrote that it was Mortimer, through his intimacy with the Queen and his influence over the boy king, who actually held the reins of government. Financial records show the expansion of Mortimer's resources, and he gained possession of lands formerly belonging to Hugh Despencer and the Earl of Arundel. He also seized the former lordship of Thomas of Lancaster in Denver, the significance of which I will touch on later. So when Mortimer returned, he had 6 unmarried children, a son, John, and 5 daughters. Of the daughters, Isabella never married. We only know about Isabella's existence because in 1324 she was sent to Chicksands Priory, where she remained, possibly dying there before her father's return. Either way, she's the only one of his daughters to never get married. John, possibly the youngest of the Mortimers' 4 sons, also remained unmarried, again I think because he sort of grew up while his father was out of the country. He died in 1328, before there was really an opportunity for him to be married. So really from 1327 onwards, Mortimer's power lay in his position at court and the influence he wielded over the king. The marriages he arranged for his daughters between 1328 and 1330 reflect his goals for personal and family aggrandizement. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the marriage of Joan Mortimer, and I don't know exactly when this took place. Could have been shortly after Mortimer's return. He obtained the custody and marriage of James Audley, who was the underage heir of Baron Audley, shortly after his return. The marriage had certainly taken place before June 1330, but I've not found a precise date. And Mortimer arranged this marriage between Audley and his oldest unmarried daughter Joan, probably aged 16 at the time, because it helped him consolidate his lands in the March lordships, as well as bringing him control of significant estates in Shropshire and Staffordshire. Two really important marriages took place in 1328, and we know the date of these marriages because they were celebrated around the same time well, they were celebrated on the same day as a magnificent tournament at Hereford. So Mortimer had gained the wardship and marriage of Lawrence Hastings. Oh dear, I've lost a slide. Oh well, we'll stay there. So Lawrence Hastings was the underage heir to the Earl of Pembroke, with significant estates in South Wales, Leinster and Ireland, and in France. And in 1326, prior to the abdication of Edward II, this wardship was actually granted to the prince, to Edward III, but Mortimer had it in his hands by February 1327, and he arranged a marriage between his daughter Agnes and the young Pembroke Earl, and the marriage took place in June 1328 at a great tournament at Hereford. This was part of a double wedding, the second taking place between Beatrice and Edward of Norfolk, who was the son of Thomas Brotherton, Earl of Norfolk. The Norfolk marriage not only meant a union with a premier comital family, it was also a marriage with a member of the royal family. Edward of Norfolk was the grandson of Edward I. So we really see Roger Mortimer sort of climbing ever higher with these marriages to his children. And one could argue that this decision to marry his daughters to the kind of heirs to these great earldoms was a prelude to his own elevation to that rank of English nobility, which took place in the Salisbury Parliament in October that year. So this was a time of increased dissatisfaction with, say, the Mortimer government, even though he didn't have an official position. And increasingly, Mortimer was humiliating the king, at least according to contemporary accounts. Henry Knighton said that Mortimer was appropriating to himself royal powers in many things, and the chronicler of Melser commented that Mortimer persisted in his displays of royal magnificence. So there was this kind of personal aggrandizement taking place all over the place. The title Earl of March was seen as, had connotations of almost regalian authority in the Marches of Wales. It was the first commensal title not to be connected to an English county, and it referred instead to Mortimer's power base, and some contemporaries really criticised him for this title. It was seen as kind of delusions of grandeur, but I would say surely he had earned it, given the consolidation of the land. So just very briefly, the final marriage that he arranged was that of his youngest daughter Blanche to Peter de Grandison, again a kind of member of the English landholding elite, with lands focused in Herefordshire this time. She has a wonderful tomb and memorial at St Bartholomew's Church, not too far from here, which was kind of discovered in I think very recently, 2014, subject to a huge restoration project. So, just in the last few moments and to conclude, around the time that Mortimer was arranging these final marriages, he was also settling old scores. I want to return now very briefly to the ill-fated Edmund Earl of Kent. So I said that in March 1330, the man who had benefited so much from Mortimer's demise 7 years earlier, Kent had been tricked into believing that his brother was still alive. He was caught, he was executed. Kent's lands were carved up, given mainly to Mortimer's younger sons. The execution was a catalyst for something of a coup. And as a result, Edward III rose up with his friends, captured Mortimer at Nottingham Castle. He was then executed as a common traitor, criminal at Tyburn in November. His huge earldom fell forfeit to the crown. His earldom was then carved up, given to Edward III's supporters in return for their support. I think it was Nicholas Orme who said to me earlier today, how was it that despite all of this, despite Roger Mortimer's execution, how did his descendants, particularly Roger Mortimer, 2nd Earl of March, manage to kind of reclaim the family position? Well, Roger Mortimer Jr., I guess, as 2nd Earl of March, proved to be a very loyal friend and supporter of Edward III, distinguishing himself at the Battle of Crecy in 1346, becoming a founding member of the Order of the Garter in 1348. In 1354, the younger Roger Mortimer was re-established in his grandfather's earldom and regained control of lands that had been given to the Montague family through his marriage to Philippa Montague, the daughter of the Earl of Salisbury. And his son was later married to Philippa Plantagenet, the granddaughter of Edward III, which eventually gave the Mortimer family a claim to the English throne. So I just want to say one last thing about Joan of Kent. Now, Princess Joan was the mother of Richard II, and she was also the daughter of Edmund, Earl of Kent. Now, for many years now, Paul Dryber has been asking me about Mortimer women in the Order of the Garter. My book is going to be on the Ladies of the Garter, and I've said I've not found a one of them. I also, besides Roger Mortimer, 2nd Earl of Kent, not found many men in the Mortimer family in the Order of the Garter in the 1380s and 1390s. They reappear in the 15th century for obvious reasons. But I think their exclusion is down to this woman. And I think that Joan of Kent held a grudge against the Mortimers for what they did to her father. What's very fascinating is that when the 3rd Earl of March died, leaving his 6-year-old son, another Roger Mortimer, who went on to become 4th Earl of March, a minor, Joan insisted that the wardship and marriage of this Mortimer Earl be awarded to her older son, Thomas Holland, now Earl of Kent, who then took control of the Mortimer inheritance, married Roger Mortimer to his daughter Eleanor, and it struck me as something of a sense of reconciliation between the two families. And it's really only after Joan dies in 1385 that we sort of see the Mortimers being able to regain any sort of position at the royal court. So in answer to your question, Paul, I think Joan's responsible for the Mortimers being kept out of this order of chivalry, even though a member of the family was, a founder member. So just as a final word, Roger Mortimer, 1st Earl of March, used his children as tools of diplomacy for dynastic aggrandizement throughout the British Isles. He used his large progeny to give him and his family an advantage, to promote them. But really, the greatest marital prize for the Mortimer family was born out of loyalty and service, as Roger Mortimer's grandson, the 2nd Earl of March, demonstrated. The younger Roger Mortimer was not only rewarded in his lifetime, but his service was remembered after his death, no doubt being the reason why his son and heir was married to a princess of the royal blood, an heiress to one of the greatest inheritance of the 14th century, that eventually led to the Mortimer descendants becoming kings and queens of England. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Chloe. A very clear exposition of an untangling of the complexities of the relationships, motivations, and sort of almost a game of chess in terms of moving people around the board for strategic and territorial advantage. We're very close to the refreshment break. There's time for perhaps one question, a couple or two questions. Next moment, so
I understand that there is some lack of clarity with the dates of births and things like that. But I'm intrigued as to why you've put 2 dates for Blanche. Could you explain that? Thank you.
Yes, I don't think I can go back. Well, this was because I was struck by how young she would have been. If so, the original date that I found was 1320, and I thought that was remarkably young for her then to be getting married to. Peter de Grandison was actually 20 or 30 years her senior. And then I saw, I can't remember who it was now, but I think it might have been one of the historical sources actually suggested that Blanche was older than Agnes and Beatrice, probably born around 1316, which actually made a lot more sense in terms of the marriage. So that's why I put the two dates, because I'm leaning more towards, I think she was older than Agnes and Beatrice, even though a lot of historians say that she was the youngest, because the marriage was arranged last. But the reason that people think the marriage was arranged last is because in June 1330, the couple are given much markle by Roger Mortimer's mother as a kind of part of their estates, and it's sort of seen as that's the date of marriage, but actually it looks as though that marriage took place a little bit earlier than that. So yeah, that's why.
And those of you who have Ian Mortimer's The Greatest Traitor, the biography of Roger Mortimer, if you look in there, he has an appendix on Roger and Joan's children, and in which Ian says, again the same point, that we don't know the dates of birth of any of the children. He attempts to list them in birth order, but Ian recognises that it's based on his speculation in terms of looking at factors such as their dates of their weddings and so on, and other known occurrences. But again, he acknowledges that that's his best stab at an order, and yes, says that some of them could have been in different orders. One more question, and then we'll break for tea.
We've just heard about speculation, and you were unsure about quite a lot of things that you were talking about. But one thing you weren't unsure about was the death of Edward II. I just wondered why you were so sure of it when there is evidence to the contrary.
You don't want to leave a king lying around for too long. I mean, it happens to Richard II as well. You don't want to leave that figurehead, and I think that I just don't think that Mortimer would have been so stupid as to allow him to stay alive when you've got a nice young puppet king that you can play around with. There are still supporters out there for Edward II, two brothers still alive. I also think that is a factor in Roger Mortimer deciding to marry his daughter Beatrice to the heir to the earldom of Norfolk, because he wants to kind of keep those brothers on side. But I think that he's got it in for Edmund in particular. So I know that there's evidence to the contrary, but I don't know that I really believe that.
Okay, right. It's past, which is the time that we've given to the assembly rooms that would be having refreshments. So we'll break now and start again at 4 o'clock. If anybody has